All right, welcome everybody to Thursday, September 21st, 2017 meeting of Kubernetes SIG service catalog. Doug, you have a bunch of stuff on the agenda, so I will play the role of the impartial moderator today. And Doug, you're up first.
All right.
ID resolution.
Yeah, just want to bring people up to date. So for those of you who did not know, as part of the context object that we need to send to the broker, one of the fields in there is a context ID. That way the broker can uniquely identify which Kubernetes cluster he's actually talking to or is talking to it. So we've been going back and forth for a while now with some of the guys in the core team trying to figure out how best to generate and where to store this particular ID. And on the SIG architecture call today, we finally got a resolution, and the path that we're going to head down now is to have service catalog generate its own cluster ID, store it, manage it, do whatever it needs to do to it, all within the scope of the service catalog API server. We are not at this time going to store it within Kubernetes core someplace. That may happen in the future, but for right now, because we're not 100% sure who else may use it, what the use cases are, and since moving it is, for the most part, should hopefully just be an internal thing that should not really be exposed to users, hopefully, we're going to stick with it being a service catalog only thing right now and keep it within our API server. So I just want to let people know that was the decision.
Within our API server is this?
So as of right now, Morgan and I have been talking about this. We were thinking of possibly just creating a new resource to hold this piece of information. It will be a new singleton resource, meaning you can only create one instance of this type of class or type of object. And it's basically going to be the equivalent of a config map kind of thing. So it's going to have just one property in there with a string value, and you can put whatever kind of constraints you want around it in terms of accessibility and who has write access to and stuff like that. But it's going to be a singleton object in our resource.
I don't think I'm ready to commit to that yet. Is there a reason that we can't put it in a config map in the core? Adding a new API resource is a lot of work.
The response I got back today on the SIG architecture call was they did not want it to be in the core as of right now because there wasn't a clear consensus that there was a single UID that could be used across all use cases that wanted to support some sort of cluster ID. And until they were confident they can come up with a single value, with a single string, with a single format, they'd rather each particular area or use define their own as of right now. That was my take on the call anyway.
I think that part that you just described makes sense. I don't see why we can't use a config map with a name that's configured in the API server, though, to do that. Like it's.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So one of the problems with trying to stick it into the core is we have to support third-party resources or CRUDs, right? So at that point, we're basically creating a whole brand new resource just for ourselves anyway. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to stick it into the core when it's our resource under our control. No one else is going to use it but us.
I'm not talking about a new resource. I'm talking about use an instance of a config map. Like, I don't know. I think maybe if we can write this up, it might help us make sure that we're not talking past each other.
So let me ask a question.
Want to write this up and we can talk about it in detail?
Well, so hold on a sec. Matt, I think you were on the call earlier today. Am I missing something here as part of the discussion? I think you were a part of that, or on for that part of the call, right?
Yeah, and yes, I was on SIG architecture today, and it came down to Brian had this idea that one application should track Kubernetes clusters separate from another, and then they'll have their own ID systems.
That is likely true. So like I said, I think this, before we go adding a new resource to the API server, I think it would be good to write this idea up and we can discuss it like we have other things. I am concerned that it's potentially a lot of code to add when we could also just, as a temporary measure, use a config map But
sorry,
go ahead.
well, I'm just out of curiosity. I don't interpret this as pushing back on discussion. I definitely want to have a discussion to make sure we get the right approach. And I'm not saying this is what we will do. I'm just telling you what the SIG architecture group recommended that we do. I am curious though, when you look at what Morgan recently did for the service plan split and stuff, you keep describing adding another resource to our model as something that requires a lot of code or is complicated in some way. I'm curious to know why you think that when obviously we can add new resources. We already have a whole bunch of them in our model. What's the issue with creating just another one?
So I don't know of any precedent for a singleton resource. I don't know. I'm not sure I can immediately think of all the implications of making there be only one. And my concern really is not the amount of code. It's the implications that I'm not sure that we can think of. And my gut impression is that I don't understand why it's absolutely necessary over just using an instance of a config map. Does that make sense?
It does, and a lot of it is, fear of the unknown, which is fair. And so let's do what you suggested. Let's talk about it some more. Morgan and I will write up something for us to discuss on Monday's call, and we'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a valid use case. I can, as we're talking, my brain is thinking of corner cases that I think we should talk through.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. It's nice to have some kind of resolution or at least path forward on this. I know that there are probably people, maybe even on the call, that have use cases that are starting to become more relevant where a single broker has to service multiple Kubernetes installations. So I think this is something that, well, I'm not sure it's necessarily in scope for beta because I think we've kind of been in a holding pattern on it. I think we're all probably interested in it. I mean, I'm personally interested in seeing a resolution on it. So.
Yeah, well, I know from the IBM side, we definitely have a very strong need for this because our environment is a series of Kubernetes clusters managed by or serviced by a single broker and sort of a control plane that kind of sits above all the clusters that's talking to the service broker. And we definitely need to know which Kubernetes cluster things came from, and that's what context was there for. So, yeah.
Now, interestingly, if I remember correctly, the guidance that Cloud Foundry gives to support this case in your broker is to ensure that you use a different URL in different brokers, and that Cloud Foundry sends like the referring URL or something in the request header, and the broker is supposed to use that, which seems a little...
I'm not sure that's quite the way they described it. The way I interpreted it was every platform should have a unique login, basically, to the broker, right? Because when the broker registers, it doesn't just give a URL, it gives some sort of authentication mechanism or information that the platform will use when it talks to the broker. And it's that information, whether it's a separate URL, separate user ID and password or whatever, that's how the broker can distinguish between each platform. And I agree that can work. The problem is there are situations like in Bluemix where a single platform manages multiple Kubernetes clusters.
Yeah. I actually found the CF docs. Like, I'm not talking about Open Service Broker API, but CF has additional docs on this.
Oh, okay.
I dropped into the chat in case folks are interested in taking a look.
Okay. Anyway, I'll add something to the notes for the meeting minutes, and we can talk about it again on Monday.
Okay. All right. Next up is also Doug.
All right.
Machinery upgrades.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, I think, Paul, you may have asked me to talk to SIG Architecture about whether they had any guidance as to how often we should look at rebasing our code because we're dependent on the API machinery and stuff. And I think this was around the same time that we were going through quite a few pains because the API machinery was going through lots of churning. And granted, it's not as big of an issue now because I think they've stabilized quite a bit. But The feedback that I got from mainly Brian Grant on today's call was that it's probably best to rebase as often as possible, mainly because it's better to handle a smaller increment set of changes rather than large chunks at a time. So I give that feedback back to the group because I was asked to go try to get it.
Yeah, and I believe Walter Fender has said that part of his time allocation is to help us with rebases. So that's probably relevant information. I guess one thing that I'm wondering to myself is whether anybody in API machinery has a read on what level or what challenges might be associated with running a 1.8 machinery aggregated API with a 1.7 aggregator. And I see now that Morgan, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Morgan, you on mute? Paul, can you unmute Morgan for him?
I do. Let's see.
Test 1, 2, 3.
There we go. All right.
Given the constant, nobody's supposed to be using these libraries from API machinery. That sounds kind of insane to me. I don't have a problem, rebasing stuff, but I don't think rebasing as often as possible is anything but a recipe for churning and constant work. I realize it's painful at the end to do it once, but it's not going to be no less painful to do it all the time.
Okay. Nal, your hand is up.
Yeah, actually, yesterday took a look at rebasing not onto 1.8, but just on 1.7.6, which should be a really minor release, like by looking at the version. But actually, they created a new repos, Kubernetes API, Kubernetes Kube Open API, and maybe some others. So a lot of packages are broken now. Some code is just completely removed. And I think that we are using currently global API scheme for registering all our types. And as far as understood, they completely removed this thing. So we need to whether to switch from client Go global scheme to Kubernetes global scheme, or actually a recommended approach. And if you look at the current version of sample API server, is to actually create your own scheme, your own registry, and all the things local. And they also ditching the static init functions which register your scheme in the global API scheme and all such things. So basically, you need to create your own scheme and pass it everywhere instead of just referencing a static scheme. So yeah, I didn't expect that, but even in 1.7.6, there are pretty major changes for us. I mean, I guess most of them are just technical, basically like change the package, or like with API scheme, basically replacing static scheme with the local service catalog one. But yeah, it can take a lot of time. I think that it is still viable to, like, if we want to release beta then 1.7.6 must have a lot of like I've seen some security bug fixes and some other things. So I guess even if we don't want to jump onto 1.8, we should probably rebase on the latest 1.7 fix.
Okay. Matt, I see that your hand is up. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to jump in because this API machinery problem is something that Helm has also had to deal with. And if I remember right, it's the only time they tend to upgrade it and they pin the version that they use is when Kubernetes has a new point release, like 0.6, 0.7, 0.8. And the last time they had to deal with all of the changes, which was API machinery, client Go, some of these things, I think it took somebody 3 full days to work through. And I don't know if it would have been any faster for that person to break it up over time, rather than to just do it when the time finally came.
Okay, good context. So I think one action item that we have here, Nal, I see your hand is up. One action item that we have is we need to assess the level of like how large the changes are. One thing that we were, I think, still trying to decide or had punted on temporarily while we finish other design decisions is whether we're going to use the 1.7, 1.8, or some other version of API machinery in the initial beta release. So here's an action item. I know that, and this is my own action item. I've already started pinging Walter about this. Walter Fender has told me that he has time, at least he's told me in the past that he has time to help us with API machinery related stuff in Service Catalog. So I think that it would be good to get, see if we can get a summary from him of what the changes are between the 1.8 machinery and the machinery that we're on. And also if we can get a read on what degree of interoperability between 1.8 machinery and a 1.7 API aggregator is, because that's very important to our story. So Null, I see that you put your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that 1.8 is already frozen now, I think, and there is already a branch. So if we really want to rebase onto 1.8, we actually can start working on that. But yeah, as I said, I started doing the rebase onto 1.7.6, just thinking that like, let's do the like small step first, just to clean up all the things, and then like rebase into major changes. And yeah, it's actually, I think this is a good idea. I didn't expect that much changes, but yeah. I think like whatever we decide with 1.8, probably the better idea is to start with 1.7.6, latest one.
Okay. Do we have anybody that's interested in figuring this out? Nal, do you want to put your hand up for that?
Yeah, I can check this.
All right. I see Doug or Morgan has their hand up.
No, it's just the commentary that I'm leaving in the chat there is that, you know, as far as API machinery is concerned, they have no guarantee that anything is workable beyond outside of Cube core. So, you know, a minor release for Cube is not a minor release for them. They don't care. Everything's broken. So I don't feel like I have any pushback on, you know, we're trying to use this, because the argument there is no, we don't support this. This is not a supported use case. So if we don't, if they're not going to support it and we can't push them to support it, then there's nothing beyond rebase when everything breaks and fix it that we have. So I don't feel like there's I don't know where to go to fix that, or to establish a policy of must be not horribly broken when it's needs to be minor release or major release or whatever. So
it's not clear to me what you're saying is not supported.
Using the libraries and expecting them to have any kind of versioning scheme whatsoever.
Do you mean like a...
when they publish Kube, Kubernetes / API machinery, that doesn't have a version. That's just whatever it is.
So we have
And you can see it, and you can say that, okay, fine, we pushed it after we broke the major version for 1.7.6, but that library does not have the 1.7.6 version, and it does not satisfy the sort of SEMVer agreement of you go from 0.0 to 0.1 to 0.2, that those are all sort of compatible and that they're only, you know, minor bug fixes. They change major stuff all the time. So it's not there is no SEMVer of the libraries, quote unquote, because they're not really libraries, they're still in the core.
Yeah, so I think there's two different parts of that. One is that, as far as I know, and somebody please speak up if this has changed after I last paid attention to it, there are no tagged versions of the libraries that you can say, for Cube 1.7.1, I can pull these 1.7.1 of all the API machinery and associated libraries, and I know they're going to work together. And then the other one is that within those logical versions, there are often refactorings that are pulled in that have significant effects beyond what you would expect from a minor release version. Right, Morgan?
Yeah, I'm more concerned with the second part than the first part, but yes.
Yeah, so I think that the churn that you see is, at least my understanding is, when they have to backport stuff, there will be some bug and they have to pull in cherry picks of things that have changed in master, and they can be substantial sometimes. Yeah, and Matt has commented there, and by the way, Nal, I see that your hand is up again. There's a long-term plan to pull API machinery out and treat it as an SDK with its own release cycle, likely in 2018. So I think people understand that this is an issue. I do not expect the major changes in minor releases thing to get better before that happens. EOF for me, Nal, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to describe how do I clarify which dependencies on Kubernetes libraries I should set. So basically, I go to the Kubernetes main repo has tags for each release. You just go there, and because it's monorepo, it has a staging folder which contains all the other repos. But actually, when we put the document dependencies, we put the dependencies on the mirrored repos. So you have to go into staging on the particular tag of Kubernetes monorepo, find the latest commit in this tag, and then go to the other repo, which is a mirror of it, and find the exact same commit, basically, to specify it. And actually, I have found yesterday I have found some conflicts that API server uses some Google text and some other library, I can't remember, Google Net, I think. So those two libraries had different versions in API server and in Kubernetes core. So when you do the glide update, it actually prints the warning that there is a conflict between two versions, and you basically pick one of them. So yeah, it's not clear. It's a bit complicated. Yeah, I mean, it's doable because basically you just depend on the sources, and as long as the APIs between these sources compatible, it just works. But yeah, it's pretty complicated.
So I'm looking for a resolution on this item. I see now you've added a specific agenda item to talk about rebasing on a 1.7.6 machinery later in the agenda. Do we have a specific action item here?
I mean, I guess I can actually, I have already started, so I can just continue working on DPR on moving until 1.7.6 and see how it goes.
Okay. Any last comments before we move on? Okay. Next up is Morgan, kubectl plugin. Go ahead.
I'm just I'm trying to work through getting this sort of what's the mergeable end state here, and I'm there's right now there's 3 different plugins in there. There's some color stuff which I don't think we want to use, raw terminal stuff. So I maybe we need to pull in a dependency if we really want that. The tests, I'm struggling to figure out which place to put the tests in, and then dealing with the kube control and getting the binaries in the right place for the plugin thing to work. If we go up to E2E tests, it's a bit high level for something that's that communicate between basically the API server and kube control is not really a huge thing. And getting the existing stuff to work with the plugin is not working particularly well. And then if we get it in now, versus later, perfect versus working kind of a thing. And I'm just trying to get a feel for that and get an opinion on what people think.
Okay, Doug, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so from my point of view, we definitely don't need extra flashy things like colors. I'm just looking for people to be able to use these plugins, whether we do one PR that has all 3 plugins. I think you mentioned there are 3. Whether we have one that has all 3, or we just do the first PR to get the infrastructure in place, and the first plugin just does register broker. I don't care much either way. But I do think that we need test cases to make sure we don't break it as we go along. And obviously we need documentation so people understand how to use it, how to set it up, meaning put the binaries in the right spot and stuff like that. But I don't think we need the fancy stuff like colors and everything else, but we do need the basics.
Okay, my hand is up. So I have a few things that come to mind. The first one is that I had pinged Fabiano Franz, who's SIG CLI lead, to review the plugins. I wonder if he's ever gone ahead and given feedback on those. Morgan, do you know whether Morgan or Doug, do you know whether Fabiano has taken a look at them yet?
He left a couple comments in there before, but nothing. I mean, nothing extreme. It was just a couple little nits, basically.
Okay. The other one is that I need to circle back with Fabiano and talk to him about this in terms of I think that I might have deliverables that have been out of band that I've been implicitly responsible for that I'm now concerned that I may be dropping the ball on. So I need to go back and talk to some folks on my side about this. Third thing is I would prefer, so I don't think anybody knows how to package kubectl extensions yet. It's probably worth thinking about what we think the best way to package them is. My inclination would be, as far as whether we're producing one or many binaries, to produce one binary that does the classic Unix binary trick of it figures out what name you called it, and then it becomes that thing. And then we can make symlinks into that in the plugin directory. I think that's probably logistically simpler and likely to be more maintainable over time would be my gut thing. I don't think we need color. And since I don't think anybody's gone out and said it, I wonder if anybody has like a strong burning desire to have stuff like this for the initial beta. We didn't talk about it when it's been in, when we talked about scope. Is this something that like people want to ship imminently with the beta release? That's my question to the group.
So I'm next in the queue since you didn't acknowledge it. It's not a hard requirement for us for beta, but it is something I definitely would like to get in there if we can.
Okay. Doug, I guess I hadn't seen that you put your hand back up again. Nal, go ahead.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure if the the kubectl plugin in its current form is really useful. I mean, like the goal, I guess, is to improve the UX, but like in Kubernetes in general, things are decoupled from each other, and like there are no plugins to deploy your service like in a single shot with like service deployment and ingress created all together, for example, or anything like that. So I'm not sure why do we need to do this for service catalog.
That sounds like a question to the group. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's just an attempt to try to make the user experience a little bit nicer. In all honesty, I'm not 100% convinced, given the complexity of Kubernetes, that we're going to be able to actually produce these in a fashion that's usable. For example, I think registering a broker might be able to be done very easily because there isn't a whole lot of information there, right? There's URL, possibly user ID, password, that kind of stuff. You don't have to necessarily generate an entire YAML file for that kind of information. Creating a service instance, that might be useful, right? Because there's not a whole lot of information there. It's the service name and the service plan. And then you have to give it a name of what you want to call this thing. That might be useful to people. The binding stuff, we haven't even figured out how we're going to do ourselves in YAML yet. So like I said, from my perspective, this is just about trying to see what the user experience feels like and see whether it's something people want to pursue as a long-term solution, or whether it was just an interesting exercise, but we're going to kill it. But I'm not going to be able to make that determination until we have something there in front of people to play with.
So I think one thing that we're kind of dancing around a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry. Nal, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that like this experience is very different from the native Kubernetes experience, and it could be actually confusing, I guess, for some people. And because like we don't provide an extra abstraction layer hiding all the details, we actually like do the patch on some of the objects. I guess like all the Kubernetes complexity will still leak to the user anyways. So I'm not sure we're actually fixing any problem with this thing. So it's a nice thing, looks like just like to play with, but I think that it's premature to release it with beta or like merge it to master or anything. We can continue looking at that, but at this point, I'm not sure if it's ready to deliver to end users with beta.
Yeah, so my hand is up next. I have not looked at the commands recently, and one of my hopes that from having Fabiana review them is to give blessing from a CLI standpoint that the things that were being done were in line with Kubernetes conventions. I think that it might be helpful if we can talk about these commands on a one-by-one basis, and probably see if like broker relist, I agree with you, Doug, it's probably pretty basic, and probably there's just about one way to skin the cat. I am not certain for other things that it's as crystal clear what to do. And I also think that we should devote some thought to what level of guarantee when we eventually, since I expect that we will eventually make a kubectl extension to publish Porcelain, what level of alpha, beta, GA are we going to consider that at? I think it's very important to consider CLI surface as just another form of API. So if you think about it like that, it seems like it can be independently versioned from the rest of the binaries that we produce. And it seems like it would be conservative and cautious if we release, or when we release something, to initially say that the kubectl plugin is considered alpha and may change. But I'm not sure that that's anything that we've discussed so far in our discussions about this, like what level of API do we consider the plugin at? So,
my hand's up. Can I say something?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't see that your hand was up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so honestly, I don't think it matters what it's called. If we want to call it alpha, even though everything else is beta, I don't honestly think anybody cares. Like I said, my biggest concern at this point is just to get something out in front of people to play with. And if we end up killing it the week later because it's that horrible, I don't care. You know, it was alpha. That's fine. But I do think, because we've talked about this in the past, and the work has gone into actually developing it, and the control guys did all this work. Granted, they were doing it for other reasons, but we helped push them along. I think it's worthy of us at least doing the experiment, and if it never leaves alpha, that's fine. But I do at least want to see it reach some kind of conclusion to actually test it, since we've gone through all this effort.
Okay, I'm just making some notes in the doc.
Because honestly, if we find that it's not useful for other people, I mean, for our own purposes, I think that's really good feedback to the kube control guys. Because then it may lessen the importance of them doing an extension mechanism at all. So I think it could be useful for a lot of purposes, to be honest.
Okay, so I put my hand up. I made some notes in the docs with questions that I think we should devote some discussion time, maybe in Monday's meeting. If folks want to think about how do we version it, how do we distribute it, what commands do we think are ready to be released, let's devote some discussion time to it. And I know that also one other thing we have talked about, at least a CLI, a kubectl extension to say relist the broker. So that's one thing that I think is definitely something that would be very useful. It's something people have asked me for personally a lot in the community and at Red Hat. So I think it's definitely worth thinking about. And we previously had a consensus that we were going to do a relist command. So why don't, Doug, do you want to put something on the agenda for Monday, and we can do like a detailed look, or maybe not super detailed, but like let's talk about which commands there are, and we can think before then about how do we release it. I'm not sure. I think there's an obvious answer for how to release it, so it's probably worth thinking about.
Okie dokie, doing it now.
All right. Anything else on this before we move on? Okay. Now, rebase onto Kate's 1.7.6 before beta release? Question mark. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, actually, we have discussed already most of the things with implications of this rebase. So I guess the question is whether we need to line up the rebase with beta release.
That's hard to figure out without a change log that we can look at.
Yeah, we can take a look at the changelog then.
Do you want to put that on the agenda for Monday too, and we'll talk more about it?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Morgan, your hand is up. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, I just wanted to ask about the I wasn't sure if we were going to skip this one or not, so I typed that question in. Wasn't there a mention of 1.8 was out or frozen or something, or was that not true, or what was specifically? I understand that that's the minor release, but why go to that versus the 1.81? And what do you think? I mean, I guess maybe we just need to follow up on the thing next meeting, but doing that versus the other thing in terms of the amount of work is 1.6. I guess is probably closer to 1.8 than whatever we're on is closer to 1.7.6. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I just thought that rebasing in 2 steps should be easier, and
Okay.
like I didn't expect any API breaking changes, for example, or API server like completely something.
All right. Well, I'm willing to look at that with you if you got
Yeah.
trouble or whatever. So
you're right that 1.8 is actually frozen, so we can start rebasing on it as well. I just thought that probably rebasing on minor release first should be easier as a preparation for rebasing onto 1.8.
you'd think, but I'm not sure that's a true
Yeah.
statement. I think 1.76 is probably closer to 1.8 than whatever we are on is to 1.76. So if you want to do it in 2 steps, that's fine with me. I just wanted to throw it out there. Either way.
Yeah, I just remember
Sounds
that
like
they
you're
were,
probably pretty far progressed, so you should probably just finish that and then we can look at it.
Yeah, I just remember that in 1.8 there were a lot of changes about code generation and some client Go things, I believe. So it could be actually really, really painful. So I'm not sure if we are ready to rebase onto 1.8 straight away. So I would still prefer to finish the 1.7.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good to me.
I understand that there are also pretty significant changes in the 1.8 machinery around code generation and the client package.
That don't exist in 1.7 whatever?
Yeah, that don't exist in 1.7.6.
Okay.
So when we have a change log to look at, I think that will be good. Okay. Any other business? We have 12 minutes left. All right, great. Well, I'm going to stop recording. Everybody have a great day. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.